You are already doing it right now, not consciously, not deliberately. But somewhere in the background of your mind, a quiet process is running, measuring, comparing, waiting to see how this lands, waiting to see if it confirms something you already suspect about yourself, waiting for something outside of you to tell you whether what is inside of you is enough. Everyone does this, but almost no one knows they are doing it. And that invisibility is precisely what makes it so dangerous, because here is what validation seeking actually costs you. And this is not about confidence, not about self-esteem, not about any of the words you have heard before. This is about something deeper, something structural, something that is quietly running every decision, every relationship, every aspiration you have ever had, and the moment you see it clearly, really clearly, you will not be able to unsee it. There is a specific feeling most people are chasing without knowing it. It is not happiness. It is not love. It is not even success. It is the feeling of being confirmed, of posting something and watching the numbers respond, of saying something intelligent in a room and seeing the slight shift in people's postures, of being chosen for the role, for the relationship, for the table, and feeling briefly like the question that lives inside you has finally been answered. You know the question. You may have never said it out loud, but it has been there for most of your life, running quietly underneath everything. Am I enough? And the terrible irony, the one this entire video is about, is that every time you look outside yourself to answer that question, you make it harder to answer. Not easier, harder. And understanding why that is true will require you to look at something most people spend their entire lives carefully avoiding. Perhaps you have noticed that the validation, when it comes, never quite satisfies. Not for long. The compliment lands, the approval arrives, the recognition happens. And for a moment, sometimes seconds, sometimes hours, something settles. And then it starts again. A new question, a new uncertainty, a new need for confirmation, as though the answer expired, as though it was written in disappearing ink and you are already watching it fade. Most people interpret this as evidence that they simply have not received enough validation yet. That if the right person acknowledged them, if the right amount of people approved, if success arrived at a sufficient scale, then it would finally stick. Then it would finally be enough to fill the thing that keeps emptying. But here is what that interpretation misses. And this is where the real conversation begins. The thing that keeps emptying is not a container waiting to be filled by the right external source. It is a hole in the floor, and no amount of water poured from the outside will ever fill a container that has no floor to hold it. The floor is self-concept, and most people have never built one. Neville Goddard spent decades describing the same mechanism in language that was ahead of its time. He said that a man's concept of himself determines his experience of the world, not influences, not contributes to, determines. Modern psychology arrived at the same conclusion through neuroscience. Your brain is a prediction machine. It does not passively receive reality. It actively constructs it, using the self-concept as its primary template. What you believe yourself to be shapes what you notice, what you attract, what you interpret, and what you ultimately experience as real. So here is the implication that most people miss entirely. When the self-concept says, I am someone who requires external confirmation to feel whole, the brain begins running that as its operating program. It becomes hyper-vigilant to signs of approval. It becomes hyper-reactive to signs of withdrawal. It begins scanning every environment for data that either confirms or threatens the fragile structure it has been tasked with protecting. And from the inside, that process does not feel like a malfunction. It feels like caring deeply. It feels like being sensitive. It feels like paying attention to what matters. But what it actually is, beneath the surface, is a fundamental misidentification of where your worth lives. Here is the thought experiment that reveals everything. Imagine you wake up tomorrow and everyone who has ever validated you, Everyone whose opinion you have cared about, whose approval you have worked for, whose recognition has made you feel real. They all simply forget you exist. Not out of cruelty, not as punishment. They simply have no memory of you and no capacity to form one. How do you feel? For most people, the honest answer is diminished, uncertain, as though something essential has been subtracted. And that feeling, that specific feeling, is the most accurate map of your self-concept you will ever encounter. Because what it reveals is not how loved you are. It reveals how much of your sense of self is stored outside yourself. It reveals exactly how much of your identity is on loan from other people's perceptions. Neville called this living by the reactions of others. Psychology calls it contingent self-worth. Both are describing the same quiet catastrophe, the complete outsourcing of your inner authority. And this is where most people get stuck. Because the obvious solution, the one every self-help book reaches for, is to simply stop caring what people think, which sounds clean and simple and completely misunderstands the problem. You cannot think your way out of a structural identity deficit. You cannot decide to stop needing validation the same way you decide to stop tapping your foot. Because the need is not a habit of the conscious mind. It is a conclusion of the unconscious one. It is the logical output of a self-concept that has been built from the ground up on the assumption that worth is something granted rather than something inherent. And you cannot override a structural assumption with a conscious decision. You can pretend to. You can perform independence so convincingly that even you believe it. But underneath, the same equation keeps running. The same measurement keeps happening. The same quiet scanning of the environment for signs that you are okay. Most people who claim they do not care about validation care the most, because they have simply added a new layer, the validation of appearing not to need validation. That is not freedom. That is a more sophisticated cage. So, what is the actual mechanism? What is happening biologically and psychologically that makes validation seeking so persistent? It starts in early development. Long before you had the capacity for abstract thought, your brain was running a survival calculation. And in early life, belonging is survival. Being approved of by the caregivers in your world is not a preference. It is a biological imperative. So your nervous system became exquisitely tuned to the signals of approval and disapproval. It learned which behaviors generated warmth and which generated withdrawal. It learned with remarkable precision who you needed to be in order to be safe. And then something critical happened. You grew up. The biological imperative dissolved. The stakes changed entirely. But the neural programming did not update. The brain that learned to scan for approval as a child is still scanning as an adult. It is still treating the slight frown of a colleague as a threat to survival. It is still treating silence from someone you care about as evidence of abandonment. It is still running a program that was designed for a completely different environment. What makes this difficult is that the program does not announce itself. It does not arrive as a conscious thought. It arrives as a feeling, a pull, an inexplicable deflation when someone does not respond the way you hoped, an inexplicable inflation when someone does. And feelings to the human brain are reality. Now here is the insight that changes the direction of everything. Neville Goddard said something that most people read too quickly and therefore miss entirely. He said, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all things shall be added unto you." And the kingdom of God, he said, is within you. He was not speaking metaphysically. He was making a precise psychological observation. The validation you seek externally is a distorted reflection of a recognition you have not yet given yourself. Ride that again slowly. Every piece of approval you have ever chased from the outside world is a misdirected attempt to feel something you are fully capable of generating internally. The admiration you want from others is the self-regard you have not yet allowed yourself. The love you seek from a specific person is the self-acceptance you have been withholding. The success you believe will finally make you feel worthy is a material translation of a worth you already have and have not yet claimed. This is not positive thinking. This is not self-affirmation as a technique. This is an observation about the direction in which the human psyche searches and what it finds when it finally looks the right way. Perhaps you have noticed something strange, that the people in your life who seem least concerned with approval, who seem most settled in themselves, most genuinely comfortable in their own presence, tend to receive the most genuine admiration from others, not because they perform confidence, not because they followed a strategy, but because there is something in the human psyche that recognizes wholeness and is drawn to it. When someone does not need your validation, they become fascinating. When someone is genuinely, internally settled, not performing settledness but actually inhabiting it, they create a field that others want to enter. Because most people spend so much of their lives around other people who are also searching for confirmation that being near someone who has stopped searching feels like arriving somewhere. This is the paradox at the center of this entire subject. The approval you seek by seeking it becomes less available, and the approval you stop seeking, because you have found something more essential, arrives without being asked for. Neville described this as the secret of effortless influence. Psychology describes it as secure attachment radiating outward. Both are pointing at the same phenomenon. The person who has claimed their own worth stops performing for the room, and the room notices. But here is the question that matters. The only question that matters at this point. How? Not in theory, not as a concept, in actual lived experience. How does the self-concept shift from I require external confirmation to I am the source of my own confirmation? Because here is where most transformation content fails. It describes the destination in vivid detail and then gestures vaguely at the journey. It tells you what to become without telling you how becoming actually works. So here is how it works, and it is both simpler and stranger than you might expect. The self-concept does not update through evidence. This is the critical insight most people miss. Most people think, if I achieve enough, if I receive enough validation, if I accumulate enough proof of my worth, eventually the self-concept will update and I will feel whole. But it does not work that way, because the self-concept filters evidence. It selects the data that confirms what it already believes and discards what it does not. This is not a flaw, it is a feature. Identity is supposed to be stable. The brain actively protects it from revision, which means no amount of external evidence will permanently revise a self-concept that has been built on the assumption of unworthiness. The praise arrives, passes through the filter, and loses most of its weight. The criticism arrives, passes through the same filter, and lands with the full weight of confirmation. The self-concept updates from the inside, through identity, not evidence. This is what Neville meant when he said to assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled. Not to visualize outcomes, not to imagine circumstances. To inhabit, in felt imagination, the identity of someone who already is what you are trying to become. The person who no longer seeks validation is not someone who received so much of it that they stopped needing it. They are someone who, through a shift in self-concept, stopped being the kind of person for whom external confirmation is the primary currency. They did not get there by waiting for the world to confirm them. They got there by deciding, not once but repeatedly, not perfectly but persistently, that they were already the authority on their own worth. And every time they returned to that internal authority, instead of reaching outward, the self-concept shifted slightly. The neural pathway to external validation became slightly less automatic. The neural pathway to internal sufficiency became slightly more practiced, slightly more available, slightly more like the default. The strange thing is that this process is most difficult at exactly the moment it is most necessary. When you most need external validation, is when you are most depleted internally. And that depletion is precisely when the shift toward internal sufficiency feels most impossible, most artificial, most like a lie. And this is the moment most people abandon the process and reach outward again, because reaching outward is faster. It is more immediately soothing. It works briefly, insufficiently, but it works. And every time it works briefly, it reinforces the structural belief that produced the need in the first place. What makes this difficult is not a lack of willpower. It is the fundamental human preference for immediate relief over structural transformation. But here is what becomes available when you begin to practice the pause between the impulse and the action, between the need for confirmation and the reach towards someone else to provide it. In that pause, which will feel uncomfortable, which will feel unnatural, which will feel like deprivation at first, something begins to emerge. The part of you that already knows, not the anxious part, not the part scanning the room for approval, the quiet part, the part that has always been there underneath the performance, underneath the seeking, underneath the careful management of how you appear to others. Neville called it the real self. Psychology calls it the secure base. Different frameworks pointing at the same interior architecture that exists in every human being, including you beneath the layers of conditioned seeking. And accessing it does not require years of therapy or a dramatic awakening. It requires something far more available and far more demanding. The repeated intentional choice to look inward before looking outward. Not forever, not in every moment, but enough. Enough to begin shifting where your nervous system goes first when it needs to know that you are okay. Here is what changes when that shift begins to take hold. And pay attention here, because this is the part that surprises most people. It is not that you stop caring about others. It is not that relationships become less important or that you become less affected by the people you love. It is that the relationship changes in quality. When you are validation seeking, every relationship is partly a transaction. You are giving in order to receive confirmation. You are present, but part of your attention is always on the feedback loop, watching, measuring, interpreting. When the self-concept shifts, when you are no longer using relationships to answer the question about your worth, you become available in a completely different way. You are not there to receive. You are not monitoring the return on your emotional investment. You are simply there, fully, with nothing to extract and nothing to protect. And that kind of presence is so rare and so unmistakably real that it changes the nature of every relationship it touches. Most people believe that needing validation means they love more deeply, that their sensitivity to others' responses is evidence of how much they care. But what validation seeking actually produces is not deeper love. It is love that has been quietly colonized by fear. Love that watches, love that calculates, love that contracts when it feels unsafe and performs when it wants something in return. The love that becomes available on the other side of this shift, the love that comes from a person who has stopped needing the relationship to confirm them. That love is free in a way that the other kind is not. It is given without the invisible invoice attached. It is offered without the anxious monitoring of whether it is being sufficiently reciprocated. It is generous in a way that is only possible from fullness, not from the emptiness that is trying to fill itself through someone else. There is a line Neville Goddard wrote that most people read as spiritual philosophy and never recognize as the most precise psychological instruction ever given. He wrote, "Man's chief delusion is his conviction that there are causes other than his own state of consciousness. Strip away the spiritual language, and what remains is a radical psychological claim. Your internal state is not a response to what is happening around you. What is happening around you is a response to your internal state. The validation you are seeking from others is not something they possess and you lack. It is something you have already decided about yourself, and then projected outward, and then waited to have reflected back. You are not waiting for them to see your worth. You are waiting for them to reflect back a worth you have not yet allowed yourself to directly claim. And the moment you claim it directly, not arrogantly, not as a performance, but as a quiet internal recognition that is not up for debate, the entire dynamic shifts. Not because you have changed the people around you, but because you are no longer the person who needed them to see something you could not see yourself. This is the final reframe, and it is the one that tends to change things permanently when it genuinely lands. Seeking validation is not a character flaw. It is not a sign of weakness. It is not evidence that something is broken in you. It is evidence that you have been extraordinarily loyal to a conclusion you reached about yourself a very long time ago. A conclusion that made sense, given what you knew then. A conclusion that served a function when you first formed it, but a conclusion is not a fact, and a self-concept is not a destiny. It is a story, an ongoing, editable, revisable story that you have the authorship of, whether you claim that authorship or not. Most people do not claim it. Most people live as though the story was handed to them and cannot be changed. They spend their lives finding external evidence for a narrative they wrote internally and forgot they wrote. The moment you remember that you are the author, the moment that truth stops being a concept and becomes a felt recognition, the seeking changes. Not because you have received enough validation to finally feel safe, but because you have finally understood that the safety you were seeking was never located where you were looking. It was never in their approval. It was never in their attention. It was never in their choice to see you. It was always only in your own willingness to see yourself. And that willingness, unlike their attention, unlike their approval, unlike everything you have spent years carefully trying to earn, is available to you right now, not later. Not after you have become something more or proven something more, right now. Exactly as you are. The question is simply whether you are ready to stop waiting for someone else to say so.